Greetings, bookworms of Concord. Pastor Beckett here with a review of The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. A very well-known book. I've had this for years, and I figured I'd finally just read through it for really two reasons. One, Tim Keller recently died, and I've been reading through some apologetics books, so finally, The Reason for God. I really enjoyed this book. It challenges you intellectually and maybe somewhat emotionally. It's not an emotionally driven book, but faith and religion is just an emotional topic. As usual, I got cat hair in my mouth. As usual, I do have some critiques, but following Rappaport's rules, I will relay what I enjoyed before getting to the corrections I think should be put in place. So this is a great book to read if you have doubts about Christianity, whether you're a believer experiencing doubts or an unbeliever who doubts Christianity altogether. For that reason, I like what Keller says in the introduction. A faith without some doubts is like a human body without any antibodies in it. People who blithely go through life too busy or indifferent to ask hard questions about why they believe as they do will find themselves defenseless against either the experience of tragedy or the probing questions of a smart skeptic. Just read the Psalms, right? The psalmists often experienced doubt, right? This is important for our youth to know because many Christians and some pastors get irritated by youth who ask questions that come from a place of doubt or just simple curiosity when their questions should be encouraged because they're normal, right? As I said, the psalmists doubted, even the disciples. Doubting Thomas, right? I prefer to call him Believing Thomas because in the end he believed. But it is human, indeed Christian, to experience doubt. So this is good for both sides of the debate. So the book is divided into two parts. The first part deals with the doubts many skeptics give about Christianity, and part two is basically a concise apologetic that gives logical reasons for faith in God. On page 14, Keller makes the correct observation that, this is a direct quote, to ever use an argument grounded in a religious belief is simply a conversation stopper which the non-believer cannot engage. At the same time, however, can't unbelief be a conversation stopper that the religious person cannot engage? So why should unbelievers have more space in the public sphere when discussing religious beliefs? All right, Keller actually makes this point 2 pages later when he says, secular concepts such as self-realization and autonomy are impossible to prove and are conversation stoppers, just as much as appeals to the Bible. So I suppose the question is, what common ground can secular and religious thinkers enter to have conversation in the public forum? I have my own thoughts on this, but they're beyond the scope of this review. Now, I really like how Keller handles the skeptic's axiom that the church is too exclusive and needs to be all-inclusive. They will usually say this because the Orthodox Christianity is correctly outspoken against unrepented sins like homosexuality and transgenderism, just as much as they are publicly outspoken against divorce and fornication, murder, and so forth. A full quote from Keller is, I think, necessary here. The view just expressed, that human communities should be all-inclusive, is a vast oversimplification. Liberal democracy is based on an extensive list of assumptions, a preference of individual to community rights, a division between private and public morality, and the sanctity of personal choice. All of these beliefs are foreign to many other cultures. A liberal democracy is based then, as is every community, on a shared set of very particular beliefs. Western society is based on shared commitments to reason, rights, and justice, even though there is no universally recognized definition of any of these. Every account of justice and reason is embedded in a set of some particular beliefs about the meaning of human life that is not shared with everyone. The idea of a totally inclusive community is therefore an illusion. Every human community holds in common some beliefs that necessarily create boundaries, including some people and excluding others from its circle. In short, there is no single human community that is all inclusive because it is impossible, precisely because their commonly held beliefs will exclude others who don't hold those beliefs, right? So to demand that the church be all inclusive is not only ignorant of how human community works, but by doing so, they also exclude the church from their own community because of where their beliefs diverge. I also like how he handles the skeptic's belief that Christians limit one's freedom. This is thanks in part to Immanuel Kant's belief that an enlightened human being is one who trusts in his or her own power of thinking rather than in authority or tradition. However, as Keller notes in different ways throughout the book, how can you trust your own mind if it's just an arbitrary byproduct of unguided evolution? True freedom is not to have zero constraints. That's anarchy. Rather, true freedom is to have boundaries. Keller could have drawn from Bonhoeffer on this subject, as he does in other places, but he uses the analogy of a musician, which I appreciate as a former professional musician myself. Any musician, whether professional or amateur, gives themselves over to practice for many hours, for many, many years. We have a joke in the music community that you need to practice 36 hours a day, or we might say more than like 72 hours a day, 48 hours a day. But anyway, as a musician gives him or herself over to many hours and years of practice, there are many other things they're not able to do, right? But with all those hours of discipline and limitation, your musical ability is further unleashed, releasing within you more freedom to play more difficult and beautiful pieces. You lost some freedom in order to receive more musical freedom, right? Another analogy I like to use, which I think is just a paraphrase from Bonhoeffer, is the limitations or boundaries a parent puts on their child. So as a child, you might have had a curfew. I remember I had to be home by 8 o'clock in the summer. That was the rules. When I had a friend who had no curfew, I thought they had more freedom. Yet little did I know that the limitations placed on me were for my own good and my protection, whereas my friend was more prone to get lost in the dark and be more prone to danger. My parents put that limitation on me because they loved me. They didn't want to be tyrants. They wanted to protect me. It was for my own good. It's the same thing with God. To be human is to be limited, Bonhoeffer says. If we were limitless, we would be gods, but we're not. And we know it. And it is precisely because we know this, that we are not unlimited gods, that it, and therefore Christianity, drives us crazy. Not realizing we are the beloved child whom God our Father is protecting with limits. That's enough of that. I also appreciate Keller's handling of the objection that Christianity has led to violence, or inevitably leads to violence. And most people's reaction is to ignore it with a cop-out like, well, they weren't really Christian. No, those people in history really were Christian, like, say, the Crusades, for example. Keller gives a much more realistic and appropriate answer. He says, Violence done in the name of Christianity is a terrible reality and must be both addressed and redressed. There is no excusing it. Right next to this, I annotated in my copy of the book Matthew 26:52, where Jesus, when Peter attacks those who come to arrest Jesus, and he said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." So we must acknowledge these atrocious actions by Christians while simultaneously condemning them. We cannot ignore them by just saying, "Oh, they weren't really Christian." We can say that it's that their actions are not according to the actual tenets of Christianity, but we can't say that those people themselves were not Christian. Now, there's a lot more I really like about this book, but my review is already getting long enough as it is, so I'll just jump right into my critiques now. One of my biggest critiques is probably what he says in end note number 4 for chapter 4. He says, Buddhism and Christianity, quote, require a profound inner transformation based on personal decision, end quote. This is not true for Christianity. It's certainly true for Pelagians and semi-Pelagians, which have been denounced as heresies, that transformation is, or conversion is based on personal decision, but it's not true of Orthodox Christianity. In another word, this is called synergism, whereas Orthodox Christianity believes in monergism, which is that your conversion is not based on your personal decision, that is, your own work, but rather solely on the work of God, especially through the person of the Holy Spirit. And when Keller says this of Christianity, it becomes self-contradicting, because on page 58, he says, salvation is what Christ has done for you, which is true. But you can't say salvation is what Christ has done for you while saying it rests on your personal decision, which bases it on what you do rather than what Christ has done. It's even more self-contradicting when in the epilogue he says, yet those who enter a relationship with God inevitably look back and recognize that God's grace has sought them out, breaking them open to new realities. So which is it? Does God seek you out, or do you seek God out with a personal decision? You can't have it both ways, because it doesn't work like that. You seeking God out places salvation entirely on your shoulders, which inevitably brings you to a pit of despair and uncertainty you can't get yourself out of. Like, did I really accept Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior back then? I don't think so. I have to do it all over again. Then you rinse and repeat. Rather, God seeking you out places salvation on God's shoulders, which it was on the cross. Another thing I didn't like is when he agrees with Karl Barth that, quote, it was the church, not the world, who crucified Christ. No, it was Israel and Rome. Peter's words, whom you crucified, was directed to the men of Israel, he says, i.e. the Jewish leaders in Acts 2:22 through 23. Israel and the church are often conflated. They're not the same. Peter and the apostles never accused the church of crucifying Christ. They always laid the blame at the feet of the Jewish leaders. Note, not the Jews as a people, but the specific Jewish leaders. But we can also include the Roman Empire, since the form of Jesus's execution was Roman crucifixion under the authority of Pontius Pilate. So you could say narrowly it's those specific Jewish leaders and Rome, Pontius Pilate, but broadly you can say all of us, because our sins put him on the cross, right? You can't even say that broadly speaking that's the church. Broadly speaking, that would be all of humanity. So next is when Keller says that the word day in Genesis is poetic and metaphorical. This is incorrect. The word day in Hebrew means just that, day. Especially when you consider the fact that Genesis 1 always ends with, and it was evening, and it was morning, the blank day, whichever day you're dealing with. He says you should read each book of the Bible according to its genre, but he fails to do just that with the Torah, which are historical narratives. He interprets it as poetry when it's not poetry. Now, and let's see, many times he talks about Christians upholding justice, which I agree with. But the discussion remains incomplete without distinguishing between human justice and God's justice, because the two are not the same. A person can read what he says about justice as supportive of the extremes of social justice warriors, although I hardly think that's what he means, to put the best construction of things. I don't think that's what he's getting at, but it can definitely be read that way without making these distinctions. So it would be worth it to add a couple pages explaining the difference between human justice and God's justice. Although he's dead now, so I guess those changes can't be added. Another minor critique is he translates Luther's simul justus et peccator as simultaneously just and accepted, when it actually means simultaneously saint and sinner. You could say just and sinner as well, but just and accepted? No, that's not what that Latin word means, peccator. He even says that peccator means sinner, but he still says simultaneously just and accepted. Accepted? No. It means sinner. Lastly is another major critique, which goes through the span of 11 pages. It's how he uses the word religion. Now, he does admit that religion can be used in a broader sense to mean, as he says, any belief system of ultimate values that shapes our pursuit of a particular kind of life in the world. But in chapter 11, he wants to use it in the sense of salvation through moral effort. This is an absurd definition to use because James espouses, St. James espouses religion in chapter 1, verse 27. What Keller is describing is not religion, but works righteousness or moralism. So the following quotes should have religion replaced with moralism. This isn't going to be all of them, it's just a few. Page 183, both moralism, in which you build your identity on your moral achievements. He even uses the word moral there. And irreligion, in which you build your identity on some other secular pursuit or relationship, are ultimately spiritually identical courses to take. Page 186. Moralism, not religion, moralism operates on the principles I obey, therefore I am accepted by God. In moralism, we try to obey the divine standards out of fear. Again, he uses the word just a couple sentences later, while the moralist is forced into obedience, motivated by fear of rejection. A Christian rushes into obedience, motivated by a desire to please and resemble the one who gave his life for us. And just below that, it should say in a moralistic framework, not religious. In moralistic framework, if you feel you are living up to your chosen religious standards, then you feel superior and disdainful toward those who are not following in the true path. The bottom of page 187, instead of religion, moralism and the gospel also differ fundamentally in how they treat the other, those who do not share one's own beliefs and practices, and so on. So basically, wherever you see the word religion between pages 181 and 192, at least in this edition, just replaced with the word moralism or moralistic. What's rather remarkable is that Keller says on page 189, Jesus was the most morally upright person who ever lived, which is true. He was also the most religious. He went to synagogue every Sabbath, and he kept the law in its entirety perfectly, right? You can't get more religious than that. Since Keller does identify his myopic definition of religion as moralistic just one page earlier on 188, Moralistic religion, that's he says moralistic religion leads its participants to the conviction that if they live an upstanding life, then God and others owe them respect and favor. And Jesus is the most moral person to ever live. He says that. This means he is also the most religious person to have ever lived. Therefore, there must be a right religion, which we understand as Christianity, since Christian literally means follower of Christ, which is a religion operating under the gospel. It does Christianity no favors, and it is too confusing for the simple-minded to speak of religion negatively in any sense. Best to use more accurate terminology such as moralism in place of evangelicalism's myopic definition of religion because of their religiophobia. At the end of that chapter, Keller claims Christianity is not religion or irreligion, it is something else altogether. Again, false. It is, unlike traditional religion, like he says a little earlier, that it does not operate under moralism, or what we Christians might call the law. Christianity is a religion that functions under grace. As Paul says, since you are not under law, but under grace, Romans 6:14. Under this fundamentally different religion, then, that is built on the rock of Peter's confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, we do good works not because they are the way to heaven, which is moralism, but because they are the way of heaven, like James describes. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. In other words, Christianity. That's James 1:27. Now, before I end my review, I will say that if you're not used to reading philosophy, this book will be challenging for you to read. It's not that this book is written for academic readers, far from it. But if you've never read any kind of philosophy or learned about it in a classroom or Bible study setting, this will be intellectually challenging for you. And that's a good thing. You can't learn anything if your intellect is not challenged. And this will only better prepare you to give a reason or defense for the hope that is in you. Right, as Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15. Now, I like to end all my reviews on a positive note when I have genuinely enjoyed a book, despite its shortcomings, and I want to do that in a different way. I normally take what celebrities say about Jesus with a grain of salt, because they often get it wrong. But I actually loved what Bono, the lead singer of U2, said in an interview. So I'll end with this lengthy quote from him. So the interviewer asked, Christ has his rank among the world's great thinkers, but Son of God, isn't that far-fetched? And Bono's answer isn't what we might call scholarly or academic or educated, but it is simple yet compelling. He says, no, it's not far-fetched to me. Look, the secular response to the Christ story always goes like this. He was a great prophet, obviously a very interesting guy, had a lot to say along the lines of other great prophets, be they Elijah, Muhammad, Buddha, or Confucius. But actually, Christ doesn't allow you that. He doesn't let you off that hook. Christ says, no, I'm not saying I'm a teacher. Don't call me teacher, even though he is that. I'm not saying I'm a prophet, again, even though he is that. I'm saying I'm the Messiah. I'm saying I am God incarnate. And people say, no, please, just be a prophet. A prophet we can take. You're a bit eccentric. We've had John the Baptist eating locusts and wild honey. We can handle that. But don't mention the M word, because, we're going to have to crucify you. And he goes, no. I know you're expecting me to come back with an army and set you free from these creeps. I like that. But actually, I am the Messiah. At this point, everyone starts staring at their shoes and says, oh my God, he's going to keep saying this. So what you're left with is either Christ was who he said he was, the Messiah, or a complete nutcase. I mean, we're talking nutcase on the level of Charles Manson. Charles Manson. I'm not joking here. The idea that the entire course of civilization for over half the globe could have its fate changed and turned upside down by a nutcase, for me, that's far-fetched. But that is all from me for now. Thank you for watching. Another long review. If you like this video, please leave a like. And if you would like to watch other reviews in the future and recommendations, things like that, please subscribe to get those notifications. Otherwise, I will see you next time. And in the meantime, God bless your reading.